Hey friends, it's Len here from 1A Auto. In this video, we want to go over some of the top problems that we've come to find on this first generation Lincoln Navigator. Let's get into it. For our first problem, we want to talk about misfires coming from the engine due to your ignition coil boot. Now commonly, when you're having an issue with this, it's due to the fact that you were replacing the spark plugs and you didn't replace the ignition coil boot at the same time. That's the area that goes between the spark plug and the ignition coil itself. Now, whenever you try to replace the spark plug, you have to actually remove each of the ignition coils to do so. While you're trying to pull this up and out of the way, you might happen to find that the boot is stuck on the spark plug. So you're going to give it a little tug and wiggle it around. As time goes on, this boot right here is going to get dry and brittle from the heat of the engine because it's sitting directly inside there. Now when this happens, it's going to be stiff, and as you try to wobble it around, it could potentially get torn or break in some way. Maybe you pop it right off of there. You replace the spark plug, as you're trying to do, put it back in, and then put on your boot. You didn't give it a quick inspection. After you're all done, you start up the truck and you let it run for a little bit, but what you happen to notice is you have a misfire condition. You can see that engine shaking all around. Now right here, I have a little piece of an ignition coil boot. You can tell that while it was trying to get removed from the spark plug, it ripped. Now this is an extreme case. Some rips you're really not even going to be able to see unless you grab a hold of that boot and you give it a little twist like this. You want to make sure it's soft and pliable and it's not torn, worn, or damaged in any way. While you're doing this, it only makes sense to go ahead and replace the spark plug boots or the coil boots. Now let's move along into problem number 2 on the other side of the engine. Over on the passenger side of the engine on the valve cover, you're going to find where you have your PCV valve. That stands for positive crankcase ventilation, and it's extremely important that it functions properly. What you'll find is that there's a grommet in the valve cover where the PCV valve goes into. It's made out of rubber. You want to make sure it's not dry rotted and cracked. Aside from that, you're going to have a tube that goes from the PCV valve up to the air intake system. On that tube, you're going to have a couple of boots. They're made of rubber. If those get dry rotted and brittle, it's possible that you end up having a vacuum leak. You're going to find that you have a running condition. Maybe it seems like you have a misfire, and you're probably going to find that you have a check engine light that comes on the dash. Now for this, it's a pretty easy fix. It's right out in the open. Grab onto that PCV valve and pull it out of the valve cover. Check the grommet on the valve cover. Assuming that looks good, you can put the PCV valve back in. Now take the hose off of the PCV valve and give that a little squeeze. Make sure it's soft and pliable and it's not torn, worn, or damaged in any way. Assuming that looks good, go ahead and follow that tube all the way up to where it connects onto the intake and check that as well. It's common that those boots are dry rotted, and if that's the case, you're going to want to replace them. And while you're at it, you might as well replace the PCV valve as well. For our third problem, we're going to talk about a coolant leak. This one stems from an issue with a coolant tube that's located underneath your engine's intake. Some common symptoms that you would find for this is that your coolant light turns on your dash. Other than that, maybe you pop the hood and you can have a sweet smell in the air. Typically that's because you have a coolant leak and it's evaporating in some way, and that's going to cause that sweet smell in the air. Other than that, maybe you make your way over to the coolant reservoir and you keep having to top off the coolant. You take a look underneath the vehicle, and for some reason, you can't see a coolant puddle. The reason why you might have a coolant leak, but you don't see a puddle underneath the vehicle, is because of the location of where this leak is coming from. Underneath that intake, the engine actually has a little belly there where the tube sits. So as the coolant's leaking out of that area, whether it's due to the fact that it's rotted in some way or the gaskets are bad, it's going to sit right inside that area and puddle up. That's generally why you're going to get that sweet smell, but you don't see a puddle underneath the vehicle. Now the fix for this is a little bit difficult overall because you're going to have to take apart the top of the engine to even gain access to where that coolant tube is located. Once you find it, you want to make sure you give it a close inspection. If it looks like it's rusted or rotted in any way, it only makes sense to go ahead and replace it. Even if you did happen to see that one of the seals was bad on either side of that tube, you have to go ahead and take the tube out of there anyways. So go ahead and order yourself a brand new tube and the gaskets along with it. After that, you want to make sure that you fill up the cooling system properly and burp out any of the air in the system. So that way there, you're going to have plenty of heat coming out of the vents in the passenger compartment, but the engine still stays at normal operating temperature. Now for our fourth problem, we're going to talk about external oil leaks coming from your engine's head gasket. Now you're going to have two of these head gaskets, one on each side of the engine. The large holes that you can see along here are where your combustion chambers would be located. That's where the piston is. Aside from that, you're going to have several small holes coming across around all of those larger holes, and that's for the coolant. And looking down along this area, you'll find that you have 3 holes. That's for the engine oil drain back. Now what can happen with this is that the gasket ends up breaking down. You can see along this one right here, where it looks as though the black area or the sealant has worn away. When this happens, oil is going to start making its way out through this area, and you're going to find that you have an external oil leak. It really doesn't seem like it's that bad of a deal though. You can just keep adding oil. But realistically, if you let it go too long, you can cause some serious internal engine damage. Replacing engine head gaskets isn't necessarily the easiest job. I would consider it an in-depth job because you're going to have to tear apart the majority of the engine to even get to these. You'll have to take apart the front to remove the timing chains, take apart the whole top of the engine so you can access the heads. Once you have those off of there, you can replace the gaskets. For problem number 5, we're going to talk about air suspension issues. Some of the symptoms that you might happen to find for this is that your vehicle tends to lean either towards the front or towards the back. That's because on this particular vehicle, you have air suspension in the front and the rear. It's common to have an issue where the air compressor doesn't function at all. Typically, that's because of a power issue. Generally, the first thing that you want to do is check the fuse and then the relay. The fuse and the relay is the most common issue that you might have with the air suspension. Aside from that, you might have an issue with the air compressor for the suspension itself, or even the air lines or air suspension shocks. But I have some great news for you. You can check out 1aauto.com. We sell a lot of the parts that's going to help you fix up that air suspension so you're riding down the road fine. Okay friends, that's what we've got for you for some of the top problems that we've come to find on this first generation Lincoln Navigator. Maybe you have one of these vehicles and you've had some problems of your own. If you do and you want to talk about it, leave it in the comments section below because we always love to hear from you. If you like the video or even love the video, go ahead and smash on the like button for me. It would mean the world. While you're at it, go ahead and subscribe, ring the bell. That way there you, all of your friends, can be kept up with all of our latest content. Thanks.